I want to talk to you this evening about, well, tradition, but really custom in general. Human beings are social animals. They do things together, and they do them in the same way. So human society is formed by shared practices whereby we follow the same patterns of behaviour. Human life without custom would be very hard to imagine, and I suspect to the extent that we can imagine it, very unpleasant. Custom is quite central to human happiness and flourishing in society. But it's an extremely difficult topic to understand fully, and I think a lot of the crisis in the modern church has to do with inadequate models and understandings of human custom, because central to the customs that we follow are, of course, the liturgical customs of the church, which are an object of peculiar controversy. Those of us here follow traditional liturgical customs, which have come under widespread attack, I think, on the basis of bad models of human custom in general, and I want to say something about that. I say we need customs. There are good customs, but there are also bad customs, and I'll say something about those. But amongst the good customs are those that form morality itself. The word morality comes to us from the Latin mos, a custom, and lots of European languages use the same or similar terms, both to pick out customs in general and also morality. One can think of Sitte and Sittlichkeit in German, and one can go through other European languages to make the same point. So some customs are not only good, but they involve the force of moral obligation. We have to follow them. It would be wrong to depart from them. And I want just to start off by saying a little more about how customs, certain good customs, can be morally obligatory for us, because there's an important distinction to be made between customs that are naturally obligatory and customs that introduce moral obligation as an effect of the custom, a kind of conventional moral obligation. Take, first of all, obligations that are naturally obligatory. These are customs that are imposed on us by our own human nature, through the moral law that governs us through that nature. They are customs imposed on us by natural law. We have no choice in the matter, morally speaking. Our human nature dictates that we act together in a certain way. An obvious example, as Catholics understand morality, would be the customs forming natural law marriage. This isn't an optional institution, nor is it an institution that is the fruit of human practices. It's imposed on us. The practices that make up marriage as an institution are ones that we have to follow just by virtue of our human nature. They're part of natural morality. But there are other moral obligations involving custom that are not like that. They are products of human custom rather than imposing the human custom on us. But once the custom is up and running, we have to go on as individuals following that custom, and it's a very serious moral obligation to do so. So the moral obligation, I'm going to say, is conventional because it's a product of custom, but that doesn't mean it's not a genuine moral obligation. An example would be the moral obligation to follow things like traffic laws. Okay. In some countries, like my own, we drive on the left. I think many of you come from countries where you drive on the right. Each country has a different custom, perhaps backed by the state, but that actually is not an essential part of the story. And once the custom is up and running, you are under an obligation as an individual to follow that custom where it holds. Obviously, if you didn't, bad things would start happening. So this is a very serious moral obligation, but the custom could have been different, and then the moral obligation would have been different. And that's as I say, conventional, a convention-based or custom-based moral obligation. I don't know of any serious moral theorist within the secular world or within the Catholic tradition who hasn't taken seriously this distinction between customs involving natural moral obligation and customs involving conventional moral obligation. Aquinas agrees about it, so does someone I'm going to be discussing a little later, a very non-Catholic figure, David Hume. But the precise boundary between natural moral obligation and conventional moral obligation is famously controversial. And particularly philosophers outside Catholicism have taken a very different view of where the boundary lies than for most Catholic philosophers. Why should there be a controversy about the boundary between the natural and the conventional where moral obligations involving custom are concerned? Well, to explain a moral obligation as arising from human nature itself, you need a theory of human nature. To explain how human nature gives rise, just of itself, to this obligation to follow a certain custom, like natural law marriage. Catholics have a certain view of human nature as very distinctive. We as human beings bear the image of God. That means that we're metaphysically different from the lower animals, like bunny rabbits and sharks, and even that pet dog that you're very fond of, and you might get a little sentimental about. Because we have capacities, like a power of freedom and a capacity for reason, that these more or less adorable animals lack. And that means that these special capacities and powers give rise to obligations and rights that don't concern the animals at all. But if your theory of human nature becomes impoverished, if intellectually bad things have happened, and you no longer believe that we bear the image of God, if you start thinking that we're no more than very clever animals, dogs but just a bit more clever, then you're going to have a very impoverished view of human nature, and it's going to be very much harder for you to explain important features of morality as generated by human nature itself. And what will happen in your moral theory is that the sphere of the conventional is going to become enlarged. Since you can't explain important parts of morality in terms of human nature anymore, you're going to start saying, they've been generated by useful conventions. And it's the conventions that have imposed this particular set of obligations and rights on us. So, for example, I've said that as Catholics, we think that there is a natural law-based morality of marriage that imposes the institution of marriage and the customs that come with it on us as matters of obligation. David Hume didn't think this. He thought that the morality of marriage and the family was entirely artificial. It was as artificial and convention-generated as the traffic laws. We're going to come back later to see some other things that David Hume thought were convention-generated, but which Catholics don't think are, because it's a very important distinction and a very interesting distinction. And it involves very, very important areas of morality indeed, besides the morality of marriage. Okay, so I've been talking about the connection between morality and custom. And clearly custom, insofar as it involves moral obligation, is going to be very important to our happiness, because I'm going to take it as Catholics, we're all agreed that conforming to moral standards is an essential component of human happiness. I might have to argue it a bit with other people, but here we'll take that as read. But there's another way in which morality matters to there's another way in which custom matters to human happiness, and it's a quite hard thing to pin down, but it's terribly important. It's very important to our happiness on this earth that we feel at home. that we don't feel alienated and dislocated. Okay, and lots of philosophers outside the Catholic world have realised this. Hegel talked about bei sich sein, things like that. The difference between being at home and alienated is, I think, important to us as Catholics, but it's important to Hegelians, it's important to Marxists. That's because it's fundamental to human happiness, and even secular people can understand that. And what helps us feel at home are familiar customs. If you go to a part of the world where the customs are radically different, perhaps not necessarily in the way that makes a moral difference directly, you feel out of place. You feel unsettled. And so there's this very, very important element to custom as enabling us to feel at home. And I'm going to come back to that as well. Okay, so custom matters to us as an important part of morality, whether natural morality or conventional, custom-generated morality. It enables us to feel at home. We can then start using this notion of custom, distinction between two different kinds of society, which actually everyone through this conference has already been talking about from time to time. We can make a distinction between a traditional society and the society of modernity. A traditional society is going to have very stable customs about which everyone is agreed and of which they share the same understanding. And there's no controversy about following these customs. Everyone kind of does it rather automatically or unreflectively. That looks like a traditional society. And then there's the hellhole. Clearly, many of us think this, and perhaps you're not wrong. I'm going to come back to this. There's the hellhole of modernity, in which customs aren't stable. They're not uncontroversial. They're constantly being challenged and changed. And there's a culture of criticism of custom, which might be well-based or it might be very badly based. This instability and variety of custom and this culture of non-deference towards custom, of constantly critiquing it and debating it, how does it arise? Well, clearly it can involve a breakdown in a moral consensus, but it can also involve things that aren't directly to do with that, but sheer social, economical, and technological change, which seems to become ever faster, and which changes the way we have to live in ways that it takes us some time to understand and adapt to. Hence the not only the change in custom, but the difficulty of forming a consensus about what sorts of customs we should have. And then there's also a division that arises within modernity between two attitudes to custom. There's the conservative who wants customs not to change. They want people to go on deferring to custom. And even if the pace of change seems to increase, the conservative will stand or sit there possibly like King Canute saying, "Stop! Stop, O change of custom. We must stick with our existing customs." And then on the other side, there is the liberal who seems to take enjoyment, possibly a perverse enjoyment, in all this flux and change. Indeed, wants to speed it up and is extra interested in critiquing custom and will very often invoke a standard of reason on the basis of which they correct custom. So they will see custom as something non-rational, and their critique of it as peculiarly rational. Okay. This is a very, very familiar part of living in the modern world. It's very natural to think modernity bad for us. I mean, not people in general, but for us, we very often think modernity bad, traditional society good, conservative good, liberal critique bad. But I'm going to suggest to you that actually reality is much, much more complicated than that. Okay. Particularly, I think, if we're conservative or traditional Catholics, we very often naturally assume that we should go with conservatism when it comes to established human customs. it is very dangerous to make that assumption about Catholicism and Christianity in general. We live in a highly peculiar time and place where we have inherited a Christian past which is beginning to disintegrate in our cultural quarter. We have been living through many centuries of secularization, so we tend to associate the critique of existing customs with hostility towards Christianity. And this kind of liberal attitude exists for us as modern liberalism, which we see as hostile to Christianity. But in other times and places, Christianity isn't part of a past that's going away. It is something that has only just arrived. Or it may be that it is yet to come. So my wife and I have a great friend who I met when he was doing a PhD in philosophy at the London School of Economics, who's from Uganda. And he is now at an occupying increasingly senior positions within the Jesuit order in East Africa. And I remember him saying over one lunch, when he was describing what it is like being a Catholic in Uganda, that much of his life as a priest is about fighting established custom, because it is inimical to Christianity. Two customs in particular he devoted much of his life to fighting. One is the local tradition of polygamy. The other is the local tradition of the practice of witchcraft. And, it was absolutely central, he said, to the salvation of the people that these practices, these traditions, be extirpated and never return. Or go back to the West, where we are, to this part of the world, in the late 4th century. Rome at that date had a traditional liturgy, a liturgy of the city, which took its highest form, amongst other places, in the Senate House of Rome. And at the centre of this liturgy was an altar to the goddess Victory, at which worship was given and prayers were offered. And in the late 4th century, the Christian Emperor Gratian orders the removal, at a time when there are still a considerable number of pagan senators, removal from the Senate House in Rome of the altar to the goddess Victory. This causes outrage amongst the conservative pagan senators of Rome. Their leader, Symmachus, starts to petition for the return of the altar. And he does this particularly when Gratian dies and another Christian emperor, Valentinian II, succeeds. And there's a famous correspondence involving Valentinian between, on the one hand, Symmachus calling for the return of the altar to the goddess, and St. Ambrose of Milan, who vigorously opposes this in the name of progress. So there's a famous letter, second letter of St. Ambrose to the Emperor Valentinian, denouncing Symmachus's proposal. And I'll read from it. But he, Symmachus, says, the rights of our ancestors ought to be retained. What, when all things have since progressed to what is better? Lands released from misty darkness have been amazed at the new sun. The day does not shine at its very beginning, but brightens as its light increases with the advance of time. What an amazing liberal St. Ambrose was, destroyer of tradition and the traditional liturgy of Rome. Okay, so Christianity, when new, tends very often to be destructive of tradition. Not all traditions, but often very many deeply loved traditions. There's a more general reason why, at all times and places, Christianity, and Catholicism particularly, is apt to be a bit critical of custom, and it's to do with the fall. We bear the image of God, we bear this capacity for reason, this power of freedom, but they have been damaged by the fall. We retain a general capacity for moral understanding, which comes with the law of nature written on our hearts. We retain the power of freedom. These things haven't been lost completely. It's it's very important that we do retain these things, even as fallen creatures, prior to the operation on us of grace. Otherwise, Catholics couldn't have learnt from a pagan philosopher like Aristotle. We couldn't have learnt from his moral reasoning. So we possess still the power to reason morally, even antecedent to the repair of grace, but it is damaged. And so human reason tends to make mistakes about important details of the moral law. We still retain the ability in particular cases to do what is morally right, even prior to the operation of divine grace as Trent existed, but it's going to be very difficult for us to do that consistently. So human societies are going to contain many customs that are problematic. Even when they're thought of as morally all right by the fallen humans, they're going to contain elements that are problematic. They may involve problems with the external details of the practice. So, you'll have people allowing polygamy in relation to marriage, or divorce, or things like that. They may become problematic not so much at the external level. At the external level, we continue going and doing what we ought, but we do it on the basis of an impoverished understanding. And that, of course, can create troubles down the line. We do the right thing, but for the wrong reason, or for an inadequately understood reason. So the church must always be ready to critique human custom and to invoke reason, not the liberals' reason, but the church's properly understood right reason to put human practice right. And that may even have to go on within Christian societies, because we relapse. We continually relapse. How does the church heal us? By providing the means of grace, which does two things. Grace repairs fallen human nature, it heals it, gratia sanans, and then it elevates us to an end transcending natural human capacities, which is the end of grace, the beatific vision of heaven. Through this healing of human reason and elevation of us, it improves the way and elevates the way in which we respond to goodness and truth. So it's doing something a bit like our natural human reason, but in a way that transcends our natural human capacities. It's directly imparted to us by God himself. The late scholastics very often refer to grace as higher reason. And indeed, that is what it is in this context, I think. So we have liberalism with its bastard reason, but it's still a standard of reason, although improperly understood. And then we have right reason, and then grace. There's this interesting kind of resemblance and dissimilarity between a lot of modern liberalism and Catholic Christianity, which we're going to come back to again a little while shortly. There's another reason why Christianity detaches us to a degree from the customs of this world, and that's because of the way in which custom is involved in making us feel at home. Because one general feature of our life as Catholic Christians is that we should not be too much at home in this world. We are viatores, we are wayfarers, we are pilgrims to somewhere that is our true home, our true patria, which is not on this earth, and it is not in this life. It is the patria of heaven. And that means that we must be detached from this world to a degree. Now, does that mean that we are supposed to enter into a peculiar psychological condition of complete alienation from and dislocation from everything in this life? Well, clearly not. There are lots of aspects of this life that are not only part of this world, but will not be in anything like their present form, part of heaven. One remembers in the book of the Apocalypse, in chapter 21, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And one institution that will not be found in its earthly form is the giving and taking of each other in marriage. That deeply important institution will be replaced by the marriage feast of the Lamb, of which this human institution, we understand as Christians, is an anticipation and preparation. Well, that tells us what our attitude, I think, has to be to the customs of this life. We continue where we can to follow them when they're not an actual obstacle to our journey to heaven, but we redirect and reorient them to our proper patria in heaven, so marriage becomes a sacrament which orients us to salvation. The institutions of the state become reoriented as part of the social kingship of Christ to helping the church prepare us for the beatific vision in heaven. The state becomes a Christian state and cooperates, as popes like Leo XIII and Pius XI asked, cooperates with the church to support the church's mission and take us to heaven. Where that doesn't happen, where we have political institutions, like everywhere where we live now, that don't do that job, then of course we feel alienated. We have to go on obeying the law. The state still has a job to do, but we're not going to feel at home in the Republic of Italy or the United States or the United Kingdom, despite rather pretty coronation ceremonies, as they're presently constituted. We will feel alienated, and rightly so, because we are dealing with state institutions that are not entirely our friends. Okay. Right. I wanted to say a little more now about how the fall implicates human practices and customs and our understanding of them in a way that takes us back to this distinction between the natural and the conventional, between customs that human nature itself imposes on us and customs that give rise to moral obligations in conventional form, like the custom of following certain rules of the road. I said David Hume had a rather expansive view of what in morality was conventional because of his inadequate view of human nature, because of his denial that we bear the image of God. And I want to talk about, not marriage this time, but another human practice that's very, very interesting. It's the practice of making and keeping agreements, of exchanging promises. So I'm not going to be talking about vows or special promises where there's one human party involved. Maybe God is involved as well at the other end. I'm talking about everyday things like involved in contracts and agreements. Let's agree to, you exchange promises. And everyone understands these things as generally morally obliging us, unless we've got very good reason, and sometimes we have, for doing what we promised, for fulfilling our side of the bargain or agreement. Where does this moral obligation to keep agreements come from? Well, that's a question. Is it natural? Is it imposed on us by human nature itself? Or is it kind of generated by the practice itself? We've developed a practice of making and keeping agreements and introduced certain words in human languages. And once this practice is up and running, then we are under an obligation to adhere to it. David Hume famously, because I don't think a lot of people took his view before, thought that the morality of making and keeping agreements was entirely conventional. People used to think it was natural, not Hume. He says, I say first that a promise is not intelligible naturally, nor antecedent to human conventions, human customs, and that a man unacquainted with society, so they're not familiar with any customs, they haven't lived in society, could never enter into any engagements, agreements with another, even though they could perceive each other's thoughts by intuition. So just on your basis of a sort of pre-social human nature, you would have no idea what an agreement was, or any idea of what it is to keep an agreement or to be under a moral obligation to do that. Why does Hume do this? Well, he's got no theory of human nature to explain the morality of making and keeping agreements in any other way. What he's got is a picture of human beings as kind of selfish animals. I mean, he didn't think we were completely selfish. I mean, he's rightly very critical of Hobbes on that point. But he says, in the context of fairly public sorts of interactions of the sort that agreements involve, you better not assume much more than self-interest on the part of your counterparty. Okay. And so everything has got to get going on the basis of broadly self-interested motivations. But then we have a problem. Look, the reason we make and keep agreements is that we all need each other's help. You need my help, I need yours. Each of us needs the other's help. But pretend agreements don't yet exist. How are we going to end up, just on the basis of our self-interest, helping each other? Well, someone's going to probably provide the help first. You know, if we're going to mow each other's lawns, someone's going to do one lawn today and the other party will do the other person's lawn the next day, you know. So we've got to make a non-simultaneous exchange of help. So who's going to help first? Well, someone's only going to help first if they expect to be helped back the next day. But if self-interest alone is in play, why should they expect to be helped back the next day? Because the person to help back the next day has already received the help, and self-interest won't motivate them, therefore, to return the favour. And the person who hoped to get help first will suddenly think, if I did reciprocate the next day, I'm not, the other person won't expect me to help back the next day, so they won't help me first either. So that help doesn't get started. You know, we're each imprisoned by our self-interest because no one can rationally expect a return. How do we meet this problem? We introduce a special convention involving words that are given the following significance, like promise or agree. If you use these words in the context, I agree with you that we will, do each other's lawns one day after the other, provided the other does the same, and then you don't carry out your side of the bargain, you will not be trusted by anyone anymore. No one will ever cooperate with you again, so to speak. And that ties your self-interest in the context of these words always to returning the help. Because if you don't return the help, you will be excluded by humans generally from future cooperation. And so now we've got a little convention that ties everyone's self-interest, once certain words are used, to returning help, to returning the other side's part of the bargain, to doing their side of the bargain. And everyone benefits from this, and so we come to understand this, because it's mutually advantageous, as morally obligatory. This has been so influential, this theory of promissory obligation. Economists, as you can imagine, love it. It's all about mutual advantage. And if you're an economics nerd, it's all about Pareto optimality, or I could go on. And it's metaphysically very simple. It deals with an easily understood problem via an easily understood solution that assumes nothing more than self-interest and a bit of cleverness. We're clever self-interested animals. Okay. This is not how Catholics historically understood the morality of making and keeping agreements. Not at all. It's always been understood in the Catholic tradition, I've no exceptions, as a natural moral obligation. Human nature itself imposes the obligation to make and keep agreements on us. The obligation to keep agreements once we've made them, and imposes an understanding of the practice of making agreements in the first place on us. How does this work? Well, I think the way to understand it is to go back to an important part of what it is to bear the image of God. And I talked about a power of freedom. And this is central to the explanation. The power of freedom, it's what philosophers call free will, is the power to determine for ourselves what actions we perform. It leaves it up to us whether we raise our hand or lower it, whether I do something to help you or I don't bother. It's a power over alternatives that the exercise of which we control. The bunny rabbits, the sharks, they don't have this, but we have it. God has given this to us, and it enables us to be, in a strange way, like him. And since he's given it to us, we have a right to exercise the power as well. A lot of you may be told that the theory of natural human rights is an invention of the Enlightenment. That is not so. Natural human rights develop within late medieval and early modern scholasticism at the latest. Some people think Aquinas has them. I'm not sure about that. But they're certainly, by the later Middle Ages, arising. People like Molina and Suarez talk about the jus libertatis, the natural right to freedom or liberty. What is that right? It's the right to exercise freedom as a power. God has given us this power. We should be left free to exercise it unless there's some very good reason for coercing and restraining us from exercising it, which then had better be available to us and be explicable to us, at least in principle. You know, if someone asks you whether you're in control of whether you raise your hand or lower it, you might say, yeah, sure, I am. I've got this freedom. It's up to me whether I raise my hand or lower it. We use that expression, it's up to me, as a very natural way of communicating the existence of the power. Notice we also use exactly the same phrase when someone comes along and tells us what to do when they have no authority to do that. So supposing someone who's got no authority over me whatsoever comes along and starts telling me to move my car, I might get very irate and say, don't you tell me what to do, it's up to me where I park my car. So now we're using the up to me expression to assert not the power, but the right to exercise it. We use exactly the same language. Scholastic Latin uses dominium to do the same job, to pick out the power and to pick out the right to exercise the power. It's kind of lordship over the power. Very, very significant. I'd say more on that in discussion, but I'll just leave the thought there that a natural right to liberty, which can be defeated and overridden and blocked by the legitimate authority of the church or the state, is still part of our makeup, and it's a recognition of the level of natural law of our possession of a power of freedom. Why does this connect with agreements? Well, think about what an agreement does. It allows us mutually to control the terms under which we do things for each other. Okay. Some of the time, we're just straightforwardly obliged, independently of any agreement, to do things for each other. You know, if you're in danger of death, I'm an immediate obligation to come and help you. But a lot of the time, we're under no particular obligation to do particular things for other people. It's up to us whether we do them or not. We have a right not to do them. We're not sinners just because we don't do, rush to help our neighbour with every little problem in their life. Otherwise, there'll be no peace. So, what agreements do is allow us to determine for ourselves that we do things for others in a way that sets terms acceptable to us on doing those things in a mutual arrangement. So, I want my garden done, you want $10. So let's agree that if you do my garden, I will pay you $10. You've agreed to do something for me, but set a term on it, a condition on it, which you've every right to do because you have a right to determine for yourself what you do in this matter, whether or not you do my garden at all, and if so, under what conditions. Okay. And the practice, the obligation to keep the agreement is the obligation to respect someone else's right to determine for themselves what they do for you and under what conditions. Supposing you come and do my garden and then I won't pay you. I won't pay you the $10. I've extracted a service from you under terms unacceptable to you that you never agreed to. I've intruded on your right to determine for yourself what you do for me and under what conditions. I've breached that right in just the same way as if I'd come along and used coercive threats to get you to do my garden for nothing. Or I'd use direct physical force to pick you up and put you in my garden and force you to cut the grass and everything. Those are obviously intrusions in your right to liberty. So is the breach of agreement. So we've got a view of agreement isn't simply about rational self-interest. It's about the mutual recognition of people's right to determine for themselves what they do, which is based on their God-given power to determine for themselves what they do. And that obviously leads to could lead to a practice of making and keeping agreements that isn't simply enlightened self-interest. I think in human fallen society, in the marketplace, etc., people do very often just keep agreements out of enlightened self-interest because they knew it would be bad in various ways if they don't. But actually, really, we should be respecting each other's dignity as bearing the image of God. I wish that happened all the time, but there we are. Okay, so at the centre of this Catholic story is the jus libertatis, the natural right to liberty, which is part of a set of natural moral rights that everyone's given as human beings through their human nature by God, through the law of nature. Not all modern Catholic writers take the same view of the correct content of morality that I've been doing. And this brings me now to a final part, or not quite the final part of my talk, where I've been talking about liberalism. And liberalism is a kind of distortion of Catholicism in the direction of revising customs and changing them in the name of debased views of morality, and including debased views of natural human rights. Liberals believe in natural human rights, but they certainly normally don't base them on our bearing the image of God, that's for sure. We have autonomy and other theories about which we were talking the other day. But there is also a kind of secular conservatism that also takes elements of traditional Christianity and secularizes them in ways that I think are also damaging. This is going to involve not the idea of a natural right to liberty, freedom, it's going to involve the idea of the fall. And the guilty party I'm now going to discuss is one Alistair MacIntyre, whose book After Virtue is a justly famous work of philosophy. It came out in 1981. Very, very popular with a lot of Catholics. He became a Catholic about 2 years afterwards. He wrote it. And actually part of a very popular movement within secular moral philosophy at the time. After Virtue contains something like a fall story. This is a story of degradation from an original condition of moral understanding to a less perfect condition of moral understanding. A bad fall. What is the degraded state of moral understanding in which, at the beginning of After Virtue, Alistair MacIntyre describes us as occupying? Well, this is a description. We possess, this is our current state of moral understanding, which is pretty bad. We possess, indeed, simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, so we talk the moral language, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. Now, this is very bad, if true. Not even Calvin, in his Institutes, paints so black a feature of the fallen human moral understanding. If MacIntyre is right, we don't understand morality at all, or barely. It's hard to see how we could have any moral responsibility for what we do at all. This is so bad. Okay. What is the original condition under which we had moral understanding? What is this wonderful lost Eden? Well, it's not Eden. It's traditional society, what I mentioned earlier, the traditional society of ancient Greece, wherein we all shared, if we lived in those happy times, the same set of stable customs, shared the same understanding of them, no one debated them, everyone deferred to them, and we were all at home. There was lots of, as Hegel put it in his description of the ancient Greek polis, because it's from Hegel all this stuff comes, we had lots of bei sich sein. We felt at home. Okay. So moral understanding is possessed by thugs in ancient Greece in the heroic age, and lots of strange philosophers to whom I'll come back, but we've lost it now with the loss of traditional society. It's a problem of modernity. And to the extent that we have any understanding at all left of morality, and McIntyre continually equivocates about it because his initial description is so extreme he doesn't really stay with it. He says the only way we can possess any remnant of understanding is through some cultural continuity with the traditional society of ancient Greece. What's happened is when we leave traditional society, we lose this sort of settled world of agreement about custom. We enter modernity, where there's no agreement about custom, there's no agreement about social roles, they're constantly changing, people are critiquing them all the time. We lose the understanding of morality, and all we can do, there's no way to possess the virtues except out of a tradition in which we inherit them and our understanding of them from a series of predecessors, in which series heroic societies, the heroic societies of ancient Greece, where Achilles lived, etc., hold first place. And then he says, there's another way in which you can have this understanding to a greater degree, is to live in a little anticipation of a sort of Benedict doctrine community, to live in one of those small communities he saw still existing in North America in 1981, where the ties with an historical, traditional society in the past remain very strong. So the tradition also survives in a much less fragmented, much less distorted form in the lives of certain communities whose historical ties with their past remain strong. So it's discernible in the United States in, for example, some Catholic Irish, some Orthodox Greek, and some Jews of an Orthodox persuasion, all of them communities that inherit their moral tradition not only through their religion, it's not obvious how much religion really matters here in true form at any rate, but also from the structure of the peasant villages and households which their immediate ancestors inhabited on the margins of modern Europe. So the next best thing to the traditional society of Greece is the peasant traditional society of Eastern and Central Europe some way back in the 19th century. Okay. And added to this, if there's a moral notion unknown to ancient Greece, like the notion of natural human rights, MacIntyre just rejects it, because it's not part of the tradition. It's not part of proper moral understanding. He says, talk of natural human rights is make-believe. Belief in them is one with belief in witches and unicorns, because they weren't known to the ancient Greeks. He says rights presuppose socially established sets of rules. They're convention-based, in other words. So he's telling convention-based stories about human rights. They're not natural. On the back, not of a form of liberalism or humanism, but a completely, I think, slightly barking form of conservatism, in which you reshape the fall story into a story about a loss of traditional society. Now, the Christian story of the fall is not like MacIntyre's. MacIntyre's story puts our lack of moral understanding and consensus as being a crisis of modernity. But the crisis of the fall from which Christianity rescues us, is not a crisis of modernity at all. It's a crisis that arises in traditional human society, where you have slavery, infanticide, brutal murders, Achilles and people like that, they went into that sort of thing. And worst of all, that fundamental breach of the natural moral law, idolatrous polytheism, lots of it. So, we're all in the same boat, traditional societies, modern societies. What saves us is not a recovery of traditional society, should that be possible. With technological and economic change, I doubt it is. What changes us is the life of grace within the church. The church, which doesn't take us to some lost traditional past, but takes us where we are within modernity, and takes the structures of modernity as best she can to redirect them like the marriage institution and lots of and the structures of the state where she can, to our true home, our true patria in heaven. So Christianity is a forward-looking religion, not a backward-looking religion. It's not a form of traditionalism, which now brings me to the last part of my paper, which I shall say. I've been talking about, let us beware of traditionalism as a sort of comfort blanket, which is a replacement for Orthodox Christianity. That form of thinking, of hostility to tradition as a comfort blanket, unfortunately became a way of thinking about tradition in the context of the church in the 1950s and 60s and before. And it expressed itself within the church, because so far I've been talking more about traditions and customs outside the church, within general human society, involving morality generally. But within the church, it took the form of a hostility on the part of clerics to the traditional liturgy of the church, which they saw as another distractive kind of comfort blanket, which was obstructive in their view to our true journey to our patria in heaven. That's exactly the way they start thinking about the traditional liturgy of the church. And as an example of this, I'm going to have Paul VI's general audience just before the liturgical reform in November 26, 1969. And he says, "A new rite of the Mass, a change in a venerable tradition that has gone on for centuries. This change also touches the faithful. It is intended to interest each one of those present, to draw them out of their customary personal devotions or their usual torpor." So we've got a picture here of Catholics at Mass going in for what Pius X would have regarded as active participation, and this is torpor. This is the comfort blanket distracting you from your path to heaven. The Pope continues, "It is the kind of upset caused by every novelty that breaks in on our habits. We shall notice that pious persons are disturbed most." There's sort of sadism about this, isn't it? Pious persons are disturbed most because they have their own respectable way of hearing in Mass, and they will feel shaken out of their usual thoughts and obliged to follow those of others. You've got to get out of your comfort blanket where you're just thinking about, it's as if you've just been thinking about what was happening to the Sunday lunch. It is Christ's will that you do all this. Well, this is clearly treating devotion to the traditional liturgy as if this were an interest in reviving the dancing customs of the ancient world, if we knew what they were. At best an irrelevance, at worst an obstacle. But this is to mistake the peculiar nature of long-established customs when they leave the general world of general human life and are taken up or formed within the life of the church. The traditional liturgy is not just another custom brought from the human past. It's maintained its form and come to arise in the first place through many changes in intervening society to occupy for decades, centuries, depending how you understand modernity, a fully established place in modernity without any trouble, under the influence of divine grace, a force that in itself operates to detach us from this world, not to make us problematically more at home within it. This is the force that takes us to the patria. This is the force under which the traditional liturgy was formed over many centuries. And in its ceremonies and texts, the traditional liturgy is a very effective representation in the world of here and now, and certainly too of the world of the human past, that this world of the human now, as the human world of the past, is not our true home. It's not our patria, because the liturgy presents to us the existing world as under the grip of the devil in many respects, and our human nature as fallen through the fall. All those collects of Lent, it's very clear The exorcisms in the old rite of baptism are about expelling the prince of this world. Exorcisms of natural elements, all of which have vanished, are about expelling the prince of this world, part of what makes us not properly at home in this world, from those elements. Okay. The liturgy constantly represents our need for grace to move us as viatores or wayfarers to our true patria in heaven, which is not absent from the new liturgy, but much, much more understated. Okay, what's the problem then, we might ask the late Paul VI, with feeling at home in this traditional liturgy? I mean, we need to feel at home somewhere, and where else but at church, when we are actually being communicated the means to take us to our true home, our true patria in the next world. We should feel at home in the church's liturgy, if nowhere else. It shouldn't be full of distractions designed to take us out of our supposed torpor. That's a completely misguided view of what the traditional liturgy is about. Loyalty to the traditional liturgy, when properly based, is an acceptance of our need for true detachment from this passing world and its purely human customs. So I put it to you that love of the traditional liturgy is precisely not a form of this worldly nostalgia. It's not a form of traditionalism in the secular form. It is not love for a merely human past, but an expression of attachment to a supernatural future, to the fullness of light of that new day that St. Ambrose celebrated when he opposed the revival of the ritual tradition of his day, the rites of Rome's pagan past.